So I want to tell you about my great-grandfather when he worked at a job, and he worked there for 5 or 7 years. And people came to know that he was a believer. He was high up in that work. He held a high position. Because he was a believer, after a little bit of time when they found out, they fired him. And there was also a lot of suffering with my great-grandmother and grandfather, and this was probably the most suffering was with them. When my great-grandmother moved from Moldova to Ukraine and they came across the border, they took everything that they had, even their horses, and it was all because they were believers. When my great-grandmother and great-father had 4 children, the government took my great-grandmother and great-grandfather to prison. And my great-grandmother was pregnant with her 5th child, and they held her to the very last minute in prison. And when it came time for her to deliver, they finally called an ambulance to take her to the hospital, but she delivered this child on the way to the hospital. And this time that went by was about 8 months that they were in prison. The government told people that if they took these 4 children in to help them, that they would take everything that they had, their home and everything that they owned away from them. But there were several people that decided to help these children, and they hid these children all the time in the basement of homes or in other buildings or barns. Also, my great-grandfather, the father of my grandmother, had 10 children. And for these 12 people, they were only allowed 1 loaf of bread for 1 day. And one time my grandmother told me about a time when they all went up to the attic of their house, and they found in the attic an old pair of my grandfather's boots, leather boots. And they were going hungry. And every day, my grandmother would cut a small piece of the leather from the boots, and they cooked it over a fire, and they ate this piece of leather, just little pieces at a time. And this was their food back then. The last time that the government came to take my grandfather away to prison, my grandmother hid him in a pipe. And in this pipe, it was connected to an oven, and she started a fire in that oven. And God blessed and took care of him, and the government did not find him. The government searched everywhere in their house and searched everywhere outside, and even in stacks of hay where they thought that maybe he was hidden, they had these long knives, and they would try to stab into the hay and stab into things so that maybe they could stab him. There was a time in school when my father had to often tell about his Christian beliefs and what he did and where he went to church. And his teacher often went to church to see who goes to church from his school class. And she saw my father. After several days, the teacher went to my grandmother, and the director of the school told my father's mother, my grandmother, that they wanted to take her children from her. My grandmother was in shock, and this went on for several years, that the teacher and the directors would come to my grandmother and tell them about my children and that they were going to take them away. But she also tried to tell them that they were going to take the children away from them and that she couldn't mother them anymore. And she told the director that these are my children and I know how to take care of them and God will protect them. And during this time, also, people that wanted to study at schools, Christians who wanted to study in the universities, they weren't allowed to. And my grandmother's brother, he studied 1 year in the university. And when they found out that he was a Christian or a believer, they kicked him out of college. Some time passed by, but God blessed him and he was able to start back to the university. it came to pass that he did finish this university, and then from the university, they sent him to London to study more. And also for Christians, even when they finished college, even if they finished magna cum laude or summa cum laude, all the same, they gave them a C. I also want to talk about that in schools, earlier in schools, they told of how believers sacrificed their children. And that is all because they did not want for others to come to know Christ or to go to church. In Ukraine, even now, they still talk like that. And there are still people today that believe that in churches in Ukraine that believers take their children to sacrifice them. People, when it was very hard times, they served God. People couldn't meet in churches, and they couldn't even meet in other homes because their neighbors could see this, and then they could tell the government. Every time they met together, they would meet at different people's homes. They met in attics. They would meet in basements and in other places where maybe other people couldn't see them. And they were in prison, and they still served the Lord. And I want to read a place in my Bible, and this is written in Romans 15:13. May the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace as you trust in Him, so that you may overflow with hope by the power of the Holy Spirit.
I want to tell everyone thank you very much for caring for me and for driving because I know that maybe for somebody it was maybe difficult or I don't know, but thank you very much.